a talk through of the slides for Dennis Wixom and Tegarden System Analysis and Design with UML 5th edition, Chapter 3, Requirements Determination. Okay, so we want to figure out how to create a requirements definition. What are the various analysis techniques we can apply to requirements, when to use them, and learn how to gather requirements, various documentation techniques, and be able to roll all of that up into a system proposal. So the aim is to capture what you're trying to do. So I think I've made clear in the lectures to date that it's the most critical step in the entire system design life cycle. We can make lots of changes, we can chop and change, it doesn't matter, we're just changing words, maybe diagrams. We're not changing installations, we're not affecting customers at all. And what the bottom bullet point says is that you can actually do pretty well with an iterative approach to requirements. So you put together small batches of requirements and implement them. And oftentimes when you implement things, new requirements emerge. And that can be quite useful and not obvious necessarily if you're just writing words. So the idea of requirements determination is to convert those high-level business requirements from the system request into more detailed requirements. What is a requirement? It's a statement of what the system must do or a characteristic it must have. So it's either functional or cross-functional. Eventually we're going to evolve it into a technical description of how the system will be implemented. But this document is primarily about what. And it says functional and non-functional down the bottom. I prefer the term cross-functional for performance or utility related stuff. You can prioritize requirements. Sometimes that's very useful, particularly if you're taking an iterative approach. You can try to do the higher priority stuff first, and that's a good approach. Sometimes you can take on the most technically challenging stuff first in case you can't get it done. That's also a good risk mitigation tactic. One thing that the requirements definition should do is it defines the scope of the system, but sometimes even more importantly, it defines what's out of scope. If you explicitly state things that you're not going to do, sometimes that helps the stakeholders understand what they're going to get. Here's some examples, and again, my personal preference is to not use the words will or should, or have negative requirements like item 4.1. My personal preference is to use the verb shall in all requirements, whether they're cross-functional or functional requirements, and to always state the requirements in a positive sense. How do you get there? Well, there's lots of things you can do. You can do root cause analysis, which we haven't talked about. I might have to talk to you about that briefly during class. Duration analysis, activity-based costing, informal benchmarking, outcome analysis, technology analysis, or activity elimination. Requirements are best done collaboratively between representative stakeholders, right? And the two representatives that are stated here are the systems analysts, the part of the development team that tries to do the translation, and the business people, right? They're the people outside the development team, but with an interest in seeing the success of the development team. And there are various ways of identifying requirements: interviews, questionnaires, or observation, a joint application development group, or document analysis. I'm not going to read all of this to you. You can read the slides as well as I can. Let me just see if there's a particular thing I want to pull out of this. Right, so scope creep is something you want to avoid. You want to try and capture the boundaries, what's in scope and what's out of scope, and try and avoid adding more stuff as you go forward. It's okay to capture requirements that are going to be implemented later, but again, you need to be very clear that that's what's happening, that they're not going to be in the next release. Lots of problems in requirements determination. You mightn't be able to talk to the right people. You mightn't be able to write things down adequately. You may not know what you don't know. And then sometimes verifying and validating requirements can be difficult. So let's quickly run through this problem analysis. So it's really good to talk to the stakeholders, the people who are going to use the new system or using the existing system, and ask them what they think. They often have a very good insight about what costs them time or what they would prefer to see happen. Root cause analysis, like I said, we should actually do a root cause. And I think I mentioned briefly in the class that this is like the outcome of the 5 whys, right? You ask what the problem is, why, and why does that happen? And then you ask, why does that happen? And then you ask, why does that happen? And eventually you get to what I call a leaf node that has an actionable fix. Right, that's what the last one is. Once the causes are known, then you can develop a solution. Often what you're doing with software is you're helping a business process. And one way to figure out what the right thing to do from a software perspective is to look at the existing business process and see how long each step takes, and then tackle the pieces that maybe you can make the most difference in. You can do something similar rather than based on time, but based on cost. Sometimes it's something that's relatively short time-wise can cost a lot, so you may want to figure out the dollar value rather than the time value. Sometimes just informal benchmarking. You look at how other organizations do the process you're trying to do and see if they have any insights into what you're doing. Maybe the thing you want to do is look at the final product. Does the customer get what they want? Sometimes technologies need to be updated. Maybe the system works okay as is, but it's too slow, or it doesn't scale to where you need to be in the next 6 months. And so technology analysis can be an important thing to try there. And sometimes people write down processes without thinking about actually what they're trying to do. And just eliminating an activity completely from a business process may be worthwhile doing. So there's lots of ways you can gather requirements. You can interview people. You can form a joint application development task force. You can distribute and get feedback on questionnaires, you can analyze documents, or you can just go and look, observe the people. Interviews are pretty good. You just go and ask people, right? They have to be people who are knowledgeable about the subject that you're trying to do something for. You should use a variety of questions, sometimes closed-ended, like requiring a very specific maybe yes or no answer. That's closed-ended, but oftentimes you get good information from more open-ended questions. And then sometimes you've got to be able to think on your feet, and once you get an answer to an open-ended question, you may need to probe deeper to get more insight for yourself and for the team. You need to prepare for the interview, you need to conduct the interview, and then you need to have a follow-up. It's always good to collate what you learnt in the interview and then feed it back to the interviewee or interviewees just in case you missed something. Okay, here's just some examples. Right, the closed-ended questions demand a specific answer. Open-ended questions will probably have a narrative that comes back, and then probing questions are more feedback on the answers to open-ended questions generally. Two different interviewing strategies, top-down or bottom-up. Sometimes it's worthwhile doing both, right? Starting from the very specific and generalizing, or starting from the very general and then specify as you move down. Here's a set of notes with an example set of notes that maybe you send to your interviewee, right? The person interviewed is Linda Esty, Director of Human Resources, and Barbara Wixom was the interviewer. And it's worthwhile making these statements and feeding them back to people. Joint application development, right? So this is where you get together a relatively large group of analysts and users and a facilitator, somebody, an MC, somebody who can direct how things work, and somewhere between 10 and 20 users. That's a relatively large group. And you often want a specially prepared room with an appropriate tables and whiteboards or large areas of paper to be able to write and draw on. You can do it electronically. These days, I suppose we would have to for that size of group, but it's possible to do these remotely. They do require careful planning and scripting, and it does help if you have somebody as the coordinator or the facilitator who's done it before. Questionnaires. You probably want quite a few responses, right? And sometimes web may not be the best, but web is easiest to collate. Maybe you can get larger numbers of people involved. One thing I would suggest is if you use something like a Likert scale, where you have, you know, a number of points on a scale, people tend to fall into the trap of allowing interviewees or questionnaire responders to choose a middle number. So they allow 5 numbers, 1 through 5. So, and oftentimes people will choose 3 if they're undecided, the middle one. Always use an even number on a Likert scale. That way somebody answering the question has to make a decision about whether it's positive response or a negative response. So that out of 1, 2, 3 or 4, they have to choose either 3, which is slightly positive, or 2, which is slightly negative. And that tells you more information than a 1 to 5 scale and somebody selecting the middle point in the 1 to 5 scale. You want to figure out who to ask and why you're asking that particular population. You want to make sure that you have unambiguous questions. You want to follow up with results and make sure you send a thank you to the participants. I'm not going to read through this. Make sure you try and make things as clear as possible. That's what a lot of these bullet points are saying. Try out the questionnaire on a small group of people before you send it to the large group, just in case there's some confusion that can be avoided. Okay, document analysis. So this is to take the existing technical documents and review them to figure out what's happening. Sometimes a way to gather requirements is to look at competitor marketing information. They may publish a lot of useful cross-functional requirements, performance requirements, particularly if you're trying to be competitive with them. That's going to be public information if it is in marketing documents, so it's quite useful. There's something to be said for actually just going in and watching people do whatever it is you're trying to implement software for. I heard a story about how people who were interested in how people showered, they did the questionnaire and they got various answers and they weren't quite convinced about the answers. So they managed to get instrument a shower facility up, and they asked people with the full knowledge that they were being watched to shower. And it turned out that the people's answers to the questions about what they did in the shower versus what they actually did in the shower were different. So sometimes observation can be useful. Right, and here's just a rough comparison about between the different ways of capturing requirements. Okay, there's other ways to do it. There's concept maps. I think we had an example of concept maps in the 3301 lecture the other day, or maybe it was, yeah, I think it was 3301. Sometimes user stories are a good way to write things down. Story cards or task lists. It depends on how your system operates. And I'm not going to talk about that. We'll talk about that later. Once we've got that raw information from all of those techniques, now we need to write it down. And the document we write it down into is the system proposal. And I think I've talked about these different parts of the system proposal before, so I'm not going to talk through them again. And there's the template, right? Table of contents, executive summary. Sometimes the people who should read the whole document don't have time, so make sure all the key points are in the executive summary. For traceability, The thing that started you off on this system proposal, the system request, should be included. Now we can think about a work plan and a feasibility analysis. Then there's the written down requirements, the shall statements, both the functional and the cross-functional. And then we get into a bit of more object-oriented analysis, where we write down use case diagrams, use case descriptions, activity diagrams to show the processes that we're trying to replace or implement. Then once we've got those, we can identify the analysis classes and put them together into a structural model, a class diagram or an object diagram. Also, when we've got those classes identified, those analysis classes, they're not necessarily classes that you would code up. We can also do sequence diagrams, communication diagrams, behavioral state diagrams, and accrued matrix to show how things connect. And there might be other stuff you want to put in the appendix, the raw results of the questionnaire or surveys or all of that sort of stuff. Okay, that's the end of this chapter. It was talking about functional and cross-functional requirements, various analysis strategies, various gathering techniques, and how to put that together into a system proposal. We need to delve a lot more deeply into all of those pieces of the system proposal, but this is just an introduction.